And joining me now, David Wood, senior military correspondent for the Huffington Post, and Colonel Jack Jacobs. He, of course, is a Medal of Honor recipient and an MSNBC military analyst and the author of Basic Surviving Boot Camp and Basic Training. Thank you so much for joining. Colonel Jack, let's start here. Listen, I've read a number of articles on this and the process and to getting to this point. I said to myself, this reads like a movie. You talk about American Hero Channel, a military channel. These stories all need to be told. It's amazing.
Well, they do. You know, we've had a lot of men and women serve in combat, and relatively few get recognized for any award for valor. And we have to recognize that because of all the valor and how difficult it is to report on it, everybody who's ever been decorated will tell you the same thing. He wears the award, not for himself, but for all those who are not here to wear it.
But what makes this, I think, even more heartbreaking, Colonel, as you know, these men put their country first, and in some cases, they even had to hide their ethnicity because they knew that there might be discrimination. So in a sense, they were hiding who they were while fighting for this country out front. Yeah,
it was very difficult back then. The farther you go back, the more difficult it is. As we talked just during the break, we think we've grown up since then, and we're much better for having recognized people who did what they could do for everybody.
David, let me bring you in on this. One of the stories, for example, Specialist Santiago Aravilla, he's going to receive the Medal of Honor for courageous actions during a search and clear mission in Vietnam. PFC John McFarland was the officer who wrote Aravilla's Medal of Honor recommendation in 1969. He said for years he wondered what had happened, and he suffered guilt because he worried that he didn't do a good enough job in describing Aravilla's heroism. That's just one example.
Well, I'm really proud that we're finally coming around to recognizing the combat valor of these men, even though it took such a long time. But I think we also have to recognize that there are bad things that happen in combat to people that impact their own sense of right and wrong, and often, as you say, result in a sense of guilt. This is increasingly being recognized as moral injury, and I think it's the major sort of like the key thing that happens to people in combat.
Yeah, and you've written extensively about that moral injury. One of the other men honored, Staff Sergeant Melvin, 72 years old, says there is no way really to prepare them for the emotional extremes of war. Trauma for some, including, as you point out, moral injury, is a violation of the senses here. And now we have these men, and I should read the third person here, Sergeant First Class Jose Rodela, the third living vet. He's a former Sergeant First Class from Corpus Christi, Texas, received the medal for bravery during fighting in Vietnam in early September 1969. To note that some of these are Vietnam vets. My dad, a Vietnam vet, Colonel, and we know the sensitivities and rightfully so, that many Vietnam vets have in the way they feel they've been treated.
Yeah, very unpopular war. We had a draft, so it was not universal service. If you could not escape, you wound up in the service. And it's interesting that all those people, a large majority of people who wound up in the service, many against their will, perform bravely and valiantly. When we're all in it together, we all fight for each other. One last thing, we go through reviews all the time. Recently, some years ago, there was another review of Medal of Honor recommendations, and a number of awards were made to Japanese American troops who were sent to concentration camps at the beginning of the war, and were members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most highly decorated unit in the United States Army in the Second World War. We do our nation proud by going back to take a look again at what people did for this country.
And I should read a bit more about Staff Sergeant Melvin Morris. I said Melvin Morris, 72 years old. He was the only African-American vet identified as part of the review. He's a former Green Beret who was wounded 3 times in September '69, recovering the body of his fatally wounded Master Sergeant from a jungle ambush in South Vietnam. So incredible men. David, you're reporting on some of the lingering effects, including moral injury, I think is something that people should recognize. Do you think, or what are we seeing as far as our government to do more as it relates to moral injury?
Just beginning, Tamarin, to recognize that there are that people come home from war not necessarily with PTSD, but not okay. People struggle with the bad things that happen to war, people, for example, I've written about many Army medics who couldn't save mortally wounded troops and feel not just grief and sorrow that they lost a comrade, but guilt that they couldn't do more, that there was something they left undone, and they carried that. We're just beginning to learn to recognize this as a moral injury and to find new ways to treat it, which I think there's some interesting work being done that I've written about quite extensively.
Yes, you have. And David, thank you for the writing. Of course, Colonel Jack, thank you for your service. And it's an honor always to sit beside you for these events. Thank you, sir.